The boss who never dared to speak. There are stories of unspoken love that remain trapped in silence, quietly shaping lives without ever reaching the surface. Some people walk through their days carrying feelings so heavy they bend their backs in invisible ways, while others remain blissfully unaware of the emotions hovering just beyond their reach. Among the sterile walls of a modern office, one such story was slowly unfolding, delicate, restrained, and quietly tragic in its beginnings. Peter was the kind of man who lived with restraint etched into every gesture. To most of the people who knew him, he was defined by his professionalism, his even tone of voice, and the meticulous way he carried himself. He had climbed the ranks steadily, earning the respect of his colleagues not through flamboyance but through diligence and quiet dedication. To his team, he was dependable, fair, and perhaps a little distant. Few imagined the weight he carried in his private thoughts. For years, a particular presence had colored his days more than any project, deadline, or corporate milestone ever could. That presence was Zoe. She had joined his department some time ago, at first just another capable employee in a long line of bright new hires. But over time, she had become something else entirely in Peter's eyes, a source of warmth he could never acknowledge aloud. She brought with her a kind of lightness that filled even the dullest workdays, a quiet determination paired with a subtle grace that never demanded attention, but somehow always earned it. Yet Peter's admiration for her lived only in the quiet corners of his mind. He told himself it had to stay that way. As her manager, he believed that to step even once beyond the boundary of professionalism would not only risk misunderstanding, but might wound the very person he wished to protect. In a world increasingly alert to abuses of power, he feared his feelings would never be seen as genuine affection, but rather as something darker, tainted by authority. And so he remained silent, burying the weight of his emotions under layers of careful restraint. Each morning, as he walked through the office doors, he told himself to focus solely on his work. But even as he tried, the simple sound of Zoe's laughter from across the room would unravel his composure in ways no spreadsheet or meeting agenda could. He was a man who loved, but a man who loved in secret, trapped between admiration and fear, longing and restraint. This story is not about betrayal or cruelty, nor about power misused. It is about the quiet agony of holding back words that might never be spoken, and the fragile hope that sometimes, in ways we least expect, life grants us permission to reveal what we have hidden for too long. And so, beneath the fluorescent lights and muted chatter of office life, Peter's quiet struggle began to take shape, a struggle that would test the boundaries of silence, the endurance of hidden affection, and the courage it takes to finally step beyond fear. The company where Peter and Zoe worked was not extraordinary by outward appearances. It was a financial services firm, its offices spread across several glass floors in the heart of the city. The space was sterile in design, marked by white walls, pale wood, and long corridors of cubicles that hummed with keyboards and muted conversations. Yet within those walls, entire lives unfolded in miniature. Hopes, frustrations, quiet rivalries, and fleeting victories, all woven together in the rhythm of daily work. Peter had been there for nearly 2 decades. He had seen colleagues come and go, each leaving faint impressions on his memory, but few remaining beyond their professional contributions. For him, the office had long been a place of structure, not sentiment. He liked the predictability of deadlines, the order of numbers balancing on a page, and the sense of control that his role demanded. But Zoe had disrupted that sense of order from the very beginning, not with any conscious effort, but simply by being who she was. Zoe had joined the firm only 3 years earlier. She was younger, ambitious, but not ruthless, her demeanor defined less by competitive drive and more by quiet determination. She had grown up in a modest household, working her way through university with part-time jobs, always balancing responsibilities with a steady resilience. Unlike many who sought recognition for their efforts, Zoe carried herself without pretense. She worked diligently, her successes emerging not from bold declarations but from careful persistence. It was this quiet strength that had caught Peter's attention. While others sought the spotlight in meetings, Zoe was the one who listened intently, considered her words, and spoke only when she felt something worth saying. And when she did, her thoughts carried weight. She was neither timid nor aggressive, but instead radiated a balance that drew people to her without them realizing why. Peter often found himself observing her more than he intended. He noticed the way she adjusted her posture when she was deep in concentration, the way she tapped her pen lightly against her notebook when ideas formed, and the subtle furrow in her brow when she was unsatisfied with her own work. He told himself these details should not matter to him, yet they became landmarks in his day, small signals that reminded him she was there. Zoe, on the other hand, saw Peter in a different light. To her, he was a boss who exemplified fairness and consistency. While other managers often played favorites or pursued recognition for themselves, Peter led with a steadiness that created trust. He was not the kind of leader who demanded loyalty, but rather the kind who earned it quietly over time. His calm presence had a way of steadying her when deadlines pressed too hard or when the environment grew overwhelming. To Zoe, he was simply a reliable figure in her professional world, a man whose life beyond the office she barely knew. For Peter, this lack of awareness was both a blessing and a quiet ache. He preferred it this way. She saw him as her superior, nothing more. That distance gave him the safety of invisibility, but it also made his affection feel unreachable. Each day he carried an inner dialogue, urging himself to extinguish what he felt, reminding himself of the rules, the codes, the ethical lines that could not be blurred. Yet the heart, stubborn as it often is, refused to listen to the logic of his mind. And so their days continued with a steady rhythm. Zoe arriving each morning with her coffee in hand, Peter greeting the team with his reserved nod, and the hours passing with meetings, projects, and the quiet murmur of office life. On the surface, nothing extraordinary occurred. Yet beneath the surface, Peter's feelings deepened like a current, strong and unseen, threatening to pull him further into waters he dared not cross. It was within this quiet equilibrium that the seeds of tension began to grow. For even the most carefully maintained silence has its breaking points. And for Peter, the delicate balance of admiration and restraint could not last forever. There comes a time in every hidden affection when silence begins to feel less like protection and more like a prison. For Peter, that realization grew slowly, pressing against him each day with greater weight. At first, it was manageable. He could compartmentalize his feelings, pour his energy into deadlines and reports, convince himself that his private admiration was harmless so long as it stayed concealed. But time, persistent and unforgiving, eroded those boundaries. The first cracks appeared in the smallest of moments. During a late evening at the office, Peter walked past Zoe's desk and noticed her still working, her eyes tired but her posture steady. He wanted, more than anything, to tell her to go home, to remind her she deserved rest, to care for her in some small way. Yet he stopped himself, masking his concern behind a neutral comment about deadlines. As he walked away, his chest tightened with the weight of words left unsaid. In the weeks that followed, the pressure only grew. Zoe had been given greater responsibilities, new projects, client presentations, leadership tasks that would test her composure. She handled them with quiet grace, though Peter could see the strain in the set of her shoulders. He longed to reassure her, to let her know she was capable, that he believed in her more than anyone else. Yet each time he came close to saying something that felt personal, his fear intervened. He told himself she might misinterpret his intentions, that she might recoil or feel uncomfortable. In his position of authority, even kindness could be misconstrued, but what tormented him most was not fear of her rejection. It was the thought that she might never know how deeply she mattered to someone, that her quiet efforts, her resilience, her gentle presence, all the things others overlooked, had not gone unnoticed. He wanted her to understand she was seen, and more than that, cherished. And yet, every day, he kept that truth buried. Circumstances, however, have a way of forcing silence into confrontation. The company announced a restructuring plan. Rumors spread quickly, carrying with them the familiar anxieties of layoffs and departmental shifts. Zoe's position, though not directly at risk, became entangled in uncertainty. She was asked to interview for a new internal role, one that demanded not just competence, but confidence and self-promotion. Peter knew this opportunity could define her career. He also knew how much she doubted herself. Her modesty, which he admired, was the very thing that might hold her back in such a competitive process. He found himself torn. Should he step forward, offer her encouragement beyond the sterile phrases of a manager, or should he remain silent, preserving the professional distance that had long protected them both? The decision weighed on him heavily. He lay awake at night, imagining the possibilities, her succeeding and moving forward without ever knowing his feelings, or her faltering and never realizing that someone believed in her so fiercely. The silence, once a shield, now felt like betrayal, as though he were failing her by withholding the very words she needed to hear. Meanwhile, Zoe felt the weight of the restructuring in her own way. She respected Peter deeply and often wondered what he truly thought of her work. His quiet demeanor sometimes made him difficult to read, but she trusted his judgment more than anyone else's. In her heart, she longed for reassurance, not flattery, not favoritism, just the simple acknowledgement that she was capable. She would never ask for it aloud, of course, but the absence of such words left her doubting herself more than she admitted. The air between them grew heavier during those weeks. Conversations that were once easy in their professional simplicity became charged with unspoken tension. Zoe would glance at Peter, searching for something in his expression, while he carefully avoided revealing the truth written across his features. Each interaction felt precarious, balanced on the edge of something unspoken, as though one misplaced word could unravel the careful order they had both maintained. Peter found himself at a crossroads. He could continue the path of silence, watching her navigate the storm alone, or he could risk stepping into the unknown, offering a piece of his heart under the guise of support. The risk terrified him, yet the thought of doing nothing terrified him more. And so, the stage was set. The silence that had once seemed sustainable had become unbearable. Their unspoken truths, long restrained, were inching closer to revelation. The restructuring loomed ahead. The interview approached, and with it came the possibility that Peter's carefully guarded feelings would either destroy the fragile balance they shared, or, perhaps, bring about a transformation neither of them had dared to imagine. The morning of Zoe's interview arrived like a storm disguised as an ordinary day. The office was quiet, yet beneath its calm exterior, currents of unease moved invisibly. Zoe sat at her desk reviewing her notes, her expression composed but her fingers trembling faintly as they turned the pages. She had prepared thoroughly, but her doubts gnawed at her resolve. In a process that favored self-promotion and boldness, she feared her quiet strength would be overlooked. Peter watched her from a distance, his heart restless. For days he had debated whether to intervene, to offer her something more than the measured encouragement of a manager. He told himself again and again that silence was safer, that professionalism demanded restraint. Yet as he saw her sit there, poised on the brink of something so important, he realized silence would not protect her. It would only abandon her. He retreated briefly to his office, closing the door as though shielding himself from his own fear. The dilemma played in his mind with relentless clarity. If he spoke sincerely, if he allowed his affection to color his words, she might perceive it as an overstep, an unwanted intimacy. But if he remained silent, he would betray not only his own feelings, but also the faith he had always carried in her. The weight of that contradiction pressed harder than it ever had before. At last, Peter chose courage over fear, though the decision felt like stepping into fire. He walked toward her desk, his measured footsteps betraying none of the turmoil within. When she looked up, her eyes carried both hope and apprehension, as if she silently wished for reassurance but dared not ask. And in that moment, Peter allowed himself to break the silence, not with grand declarations, not with the language of romance, but with the steady truth of belief. That he spoke words that were simple, yet carried the full depth of his heart. He told her that he had seen her persistence, her quiet strength, her unwavering commitment. He told her she had already proven her worth long before any interview could measure it. And though he did not confess the fullness of his feelings, every word was infused with the affection he had hidden for so long. It was not a profession of love, but it was something just as dangerous, honesty. As Zoe's eyes softened as he spoke, relief washed across her features, as though the weight of doubt had been lifted, if only slightly. She nodded, not with the polite gratitude of an employee receiving feedback, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had longed to be truly seen. For a fleeting moment, their silence broke, not into words of romance, but into something more fragile, a mutual understanding neither dared name. She went into the interview carrying his words like armor. And though Peter remained at his desk, each tick of the clock felt like an eternity. He imagined the questions, her responses, the doubt that might return. He wanted so desperately to protect her from failure, yet knew the outcome was now beyond his hands. When Zoe emerged, her posture was straighter, her eyes brighter. She gave no dramatic display of emotion, but Peter knew immediately that she had carried herself with the strength he always believed she possessed. Still, he said nothing more, retreating once again into the silence that had become his refuge. The days that followed stretched painfully, filled with speculation and rumor. As decisions were made behind closed doors, Zoe continued her work with steady diligence, though Peter could sense the quiet anticipation beneath her calm. For him, those days were a test of endurance. He had revealed more than he ever intended, stepped closer to the edge than he believed possible, and now he lived with the uncertainty of what she might have understood from his words. Finally, the announcement came. Zoe was chosen for the role. Her name was read aloud in a brief meeting, and applause followed, echoing through the office. Peter clapped with the others, his expression steady, yet inside his heart surged with pride. She had done it, not because of him, but because of the strength that had always been hers. Still, he could not deny that in some small way, he had crossed a line that day, a line between silence and truth. What he did not expect was what came after. Later that evening, as most of the office had emptied, Zoe passed by his door. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the frame, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something unspoken in her gaze, gratitude, perhaps, but also something warmer, something that lingered longer than courtesy. And in that silent exchange, Peter realized the course of their lives had shifted. The boundary he had so carefully guarded had been breached, not recklessly, but with sincerity. And though uncertainty still loomed, for the first time he felt that silence might no longer be his prison. It might instead be the space between words yet to be spoken, waiting for the courage to finally give them life. In the days after Zoe's promotion, the atmosphere within the office shifted. To most, it was just another corporate adjustment, a change in title, a new set of responsibilities. But to Peter, it felt like watching a door quietly open in her life, a threshold she had earned through her own resilience. He observed her from a respectful distance, noticing how she carried herself with a new steadiness, as though the validation she had long denied herself had finally been granted. For Zoe, the change was more than professional. The role brought challenges, yes, but it also brought a quiet sense of belonging she had not fully felt before. What lingered in her mind most, however, were Peter's words, the simple, steady reassurance he had given her at her most vulnerable moment. They returned to her in fragments throughout her days, surfacing in quiet moments when she doubted herself. It was not just the content of his words, but the sincerity behind them, the way he had looked at her with an intensity that suggested something deeper. Peter, meanwhile, found himself caught between relief and uncertainty. He was proud of Zoe's success, but he also carried the unease of having stepped closer to revealing himself than he ever intended. At night, he replayed their brief exchange in his mind, wondering if she had understood the depth of what he had meant, or if she had seen only the surface, the encouragement of a mentor. That ambiguity both comforted and tormented him. In the office, their interactions continued, professional on the surface yet tinged with something unspoken. A glance held a little too long, a shared silence that felt heavier than mere routine. To the rest of the team, nothing seemed unusual, but for Peter and Zoe, the air between them had changed. It was as though they both stood at the edge of a conversation that had not yet begun, each waiting for the other to step forward. Peter reflected often on the nature of boundaries. He had lived so much of his life with restraint, believing that control was the only way to preserve integrity. Yet now he wondered whether restraint, taken too far, was not a virtue but a cage. For years he had told himself silence was protection. Protection for Zoe, protection for his career, protection for the balance of the workplace. But was it truly protection, or was it fear disguised as nobility? Zoe, too, began to reflect. She thought of Peter not just as her manager, but as a man, one whose quiet support had been more meaningful than any grand display. She sensed there was more to him than he ever allowed to show, something carefully hidden beneath layers of professionalism. And though she did not fully understand it, she felt drawn to that hidden depth, curious in ways she could not yet name. Their story had not reached its conclusion, but it had shifted from silence toward possibility. The lines between admiration, gratitude, and something more had begun to blur. And in that fragile space, both Peter and Zoe found themselves quietly preparing, not for another corporate change, but for the conversation that would one day decide the course of their lives. Weeks passed, and the new rhythm of the office settled into place. Zoe adapted to her role with quiet confidence, gradually discovering that she was not only capable but thriving. She brought her own style of leadership, measured, thoughtful, steady, and others quickly grew to respect her for it. To Peter, watching her transformation was both a joy and a quiet ache. He admired her more than ever, yet the question of his own silence lingered in every thought, the weight he carried. For so long had begun to change. It was no longer a burden of fear, but rather a call toward courage. He had already crossed one threshold by speaking sincerely to her, and though he had not confessed the depth of his feelings, that honesty had altered the air between them. It was no longer enough to live in half-truths. The time had come for him to step beyond restraint, to trust that what he felt was not corruption but care. One evening, as the office lights dimmed and the halls grew quiet, their paths crossed once more. Zoe lingered by his doorway, just as she had on the night of her promotion. Her eyes held the same warmth, but this time there was no uncertainty in them. She had seen the depth of his care, had felt the sincerity that distinguished him from others, and though she could not name the shape of what existed between them, she knew it was not something to fear. Peter spoke first, though his words were not rehearsed. He told her, simply, that his admiration for her extended beyond her work, that she had changed the way he saw not only the office, but life itself. He confessed that he had long silenced himself out of respect, afraid that his role might cast shadows over what was real. But now, he could not deny what his heart had carried. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of honesty. Finally given life, Zoe listened quietly, her expression soft, her eyes steady. And when he finished, she did not recoil, nor did she retreat behind the veil of professionalism. Instead, she allowed silence to linger, a silence not of avoidance, but of recognition. She had felt his care long before this moment, and now, hearing it spoken, it felt less like revelation and more like confirmation of something her heart had already begun to understand. That in that quiet, unadorned exchange, something profound shifted. There was no grand display, no sudden rush of passion, only the steady unfolding of truth. And in its simplicity lay its power. They were no longer bound by fear or hidden glances. They were two people, both strong in their own ways, acknowledging the bond that had grown between them despite every barrier. From that day forward, their story did not become easier, nor did it abandon the complexities of workplace boundaries and cautious steps. But it did become honest. And honesty, once spoken, has a way of reshaping everything. For Peter, it was liberation from years of silence, from the weight of unspoken longing. For Zoe, it was affirmation that she was not only respected for her abilities, but deeply valued for who she was. Together, they began to navigate the uncertain path ahead, not with fear, but with the quiet conviction that some risks are worth taking when guided by sincerity. And so, beneath the ordinary hum of office life, amidst spreadsheets and meetings and the endless rhythm of deadlines, a story of love unfolded, not through grand gestures or reckless confessions, but through patience, respect, and the courage to finally speak the truth. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are not those shouted to the world, but those whispered into existence by two hearts willing to step beyond silence. The end.